At some point, the intellect, even if we don't realize it, even when a teaching isn't talking directly to the intellect, it is actually talking to the intellect, and it starts changing how we see things, how we interpret things. So there's that side, the framework, and at the very beginning of the framework, the concept, the description, is that we need to be clear on what we're seeking, what is available. And the more clear we are on that, the more that we've really asked that question and refined the answer till it starts making real sense to us, the more that we are clear on that, the more focused our seeking will be. The less cul-de-sacs we'll tend to get caught up in. And the suggestion is, this teaching tends to address things in practical terms often. Today's talk might go off that a little bit, but generally speaking it addresses things in practical terms. And so it says, practically speaking. So ask yourself the question, practically speaking, what am I looking for? You know, we might have the word enlightenment as the answer, and what is that? In practical terms, what will we have after enlightenment that we didn't have before? So having just the word enlightenment can actually be as pointless as having a wrong answer to this question, what am I seeking? Because it could just be a word, and we might think we know. We might think we have an answer because we have a word, enlightenment. But the suggestion in the teaching is be much more practical than just a word. Even the idea that we might be looking for oneness, the falling away of duality, let's say. Why? What will that give you? Or what benefit will that have? What's the big deal in oneness, for example? And there are people, seekers, that have been seeking for 20, 30 years along the lines that I'm describing, i.e. without a very practical, clear understanding of what's available and why it's important, why it might be worthwhile devoting time and energy to this. So the suggested answer to the question, and all of the concepts are suggested concepts, which really mean use them as pointers to investigate for yourself based on an investigation of your own life experience and see if the pointers are accurate. I have the utmost confidence that from a certain perspective of looking at life, the pointers are accurate. But don't take my confidence as an excuse to just believe them, because if we just believe a description, it doesn't go very deep. It doesn't affect us that deeply. But when we see it, and wow, I never looked at it that way, and now I see it, it's so obvious. The old way, which maybe was seeing the dynamics incorrectly, tends to dissolve when it's really seen. And that when it's seen, someone can ask you, can you explain this to me? And you can, because you've seen it, and not just a glimpse for half a second, or you see it repeatedly based on this investigation of your own life experience. And the pointers, the concepts are pointing you, because our life experience is very vast. The pointers are pointing us specifically at what might be worth looking at in relation to this topic of enlightenment. And in practical terms, the description of enlightenment is unbroken peace of mind in daily living. unbroken peace of mind regardless of the circumstance you find yourself in. Regardless of life in that moment is pleasure or pain. That's the interconnected opposites of the flow of life. Sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. And the pleasure and pain can take a whole range of different forms that fit into categories of physical pleasure and pain, emotional pleasure and pain, financial pleasure and pain. But in general, whatever circumstance happens in life is an outcome. The door slams, it's part of the circumstance. It's an outcome in the moment. It's either pleasurable or painful, depending on how that outcome aligns or doesn't align with your biological preferences. So all of this speak was just a whole lot of concepts, a whole lot of descriptions that, if they're understood intellectually, can become the basis of an investigation for yourself based on your own life experience. So this basic notion that life is always either pleasure or pain is hugely important when it comes to unbroken peace of mind in daily living. So the core of the concept say, be clear on what you're looking for. The suggested answer is what's available as enlightenment for the human being is unbroken peace of mind, which means the end of suffering. So unbroken peace of mind is not the gaining of bliss or an experience of oneness. It is the very simple falling away, non-arising absence of suffering. That's a practical, clear description of peace of mind, which is also described as real happiness for the human being. Peace of mind is real happiness, and it's described as what enlightenment is according to this concept, this set of teachings. And suffering doesn't refer to the end of painful circumstance. And often in the English language, people will exchange the word suffering and pain in a conceptual framework that is putting forward concepts to enable us to start seeing our life experience more precisely, more specifically. It's important to distinguish something such as this. Suffering is not talking about pain. So the definition of suffering is our attitude towards the pleasure and pain of the flow of life. And our attitude can be one of two attitudes, more or less. What is the attitude towards the flow of life that tends to create the extra layer of suffering? The attitude to the flow of life that creates the extra layer of suffering could be referred to as the attitude of personal doership. And alongside personal doership, the attitude of attachment to outcomes. And that attitude is based on deeply ingrained beliefs about who we are and how life works. And if life has put in place those deeply ingrained beliefs about who we are and how life is, that means that's how we see life when it happens. That's how we interpret it. And therefore the circumstance happens, and there will be this attitude to the circumstance based on the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership and attachment to outcome. So that means if the deeply ingrained beliefs of doership and attachment to outcome are there, we're forced to suffer when the flow of life happens, because our attitude to the flow of life is coming from this root. The great news is that the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome is an incorrect, an erroneous assessment of the nature of life. That means that the suffering is essentially an error, which is why it can come to an end. The belief needs to be seen as erroneous. The belief, once seen as erroneous, is bound to dissolve if that seeing is sustained, because the untrue can't survive in the light of awareness. You can't maintain a false perception when your own system is pointing out the fallacy of that false perception. So this is the reason why this shift from suffering to peace of mind is available. So in Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths start off with the first noble truth: life is suffering. And that really is just an acknowledgement of the default human condition, which I've described as the inclusion of two main beliefs that are being categorized as the belief in personal doership and the belief in attachment to outcomes. And because they are inserted as part of our development in life, then we are forced to have an attitude towards life that is uncomfortable. An attitude that manifests in practical terms as guilt and shame, blame and hatred, pride and arrogance, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. And under each of those, there are lots of subtypes of suffering. So under blame, you can find jealousy, resentment, anger. Under guilt, you can find insecurity and lack of self-confidence, worthlessness, sense of abandonment. So all of these feelings that the human being is forced to carry around, this load of guilt and blame and pride, are all based on this ingrained belief which comes from a way of seeing life. And so those ingrained beliefs essentially is our self-image, what we know ourselves as. And when it is investigated, we find that's a psychological entity that gets put in place. And that psychological entity essentially covers up, acts as a veil to what we could say is a more authentic connection to the core of the human being. And that's not anyone's fault. That's something that has happened as part of this creation of life. I wasn't going to talk about the framework, and it seems like I'm talking about the framework. I was just going to touch on it so that I could say that there's two main parts to the teaching. The framework, which I have a huge admiration for, because if it does become something that you understand as a framework, it gets laid out as I'm doing, step by step by step. And if I miss something, it's only because I've forgotten to miss something. So if you think there's a gap somewhere, it's because I forgot to put in that piece of the framework. The framework is robust. And if it becomes part of your makeup, if it's destiny for it to resonate, and there's some people that just don't resonate with words, you know, they function differently, they need different things to penetrate. You know? And so then there's bhakti yoga instead of jnana yoga, for example. There's karma yoga for different personality types. If it's destiny for this framework to resonate and it sets in, it becomes something that starts to function automatically, and the investigation of your own daily life according to the concepts or in line with the concepts starts to happen. And as that happens, the understanding goes deeper and deeper and deeper. And as the understanding goes deeper and deeper and deeper, it uproots the misunderstanding. It uproots what has been deeply ingrained in us because of years and years and years of seeing life, interpreting life, concluding life a certain way, maybe even lifetimes of it. And the suffering starts to get cut off. And as the understanding goes deeper and deeper, the suffering gets cut off quicker and quicker, because it's seen as a manifestation of an error. So blame, as an example of one of the forms of suffering that is based on the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. Blame is when the other functions a particular way, the way, according to this teaching, that they are destined to function based on their makeup, that they didn't control. None of us chose to be exactly the way we are. We are a byproduct of a very impersonal movement of an amazingly diverse process of life. And so blame is when the other functions according to their design, according to destiny, you could say, predetermined by everything that came before. And that functioning delivers pain to me. They say they were going to pick me up from the airport, for example, and then they forget, and I'm left waiting. Or they were going to take me to the airport and they forget, and I miss my aeroplane. So pain in the moment. That is my circumstance, not in line with my biological preferences of getting on the plane when it was scheduled. And pain in the moment. With the attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcome, I see the other as a separate, independent entity that is in complete control of how they think, how they feel, and how they act. That is what I'm describing as a false interpretation of life, because if we investigate it more closely, we'll see that they are always functioning according to their complex design that they didn't control. The functioning is a happening. If I fail to see that, I see them as the doer, and I say to myself, you could have acted differently. Life, circumstance could have been different to the way that it turned out. In Buddhism, this misunderstanding is called ignorance. What it means is that attitude to the circumstance, that psychological narrative that says life could have been different. And when I say life, I really mean the functioning of that person that impacted the way the circumstance unfolded. That's ignorance. That attitude is a misguided interpretation of life. And furthermore, based on this psychological entity that gets put in place, there is the deeply ingrained belief that my completion, that my wholeness, is dependent on life being pleasure, 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 pleasure. Meaning, I feel that one day when I receive a certain set of pleasures, or a certain set of outcomes, everything will be okay. So I believe that the uncomfortable feeling is because of circumstance, because of pain. And so the combination of this, seeing the other as the doer, so it's their fault because they acted a particular way, and how they acted delivered pain, which I see as an attack on my completeness, then I'm forced to hate them. You hurt me, I hate you. And that is the very uncomfortable and often prolonged load of suffering on top of the painful circumstance of the moment. Liberation, enlightenment, in this teaching isn't talking about becoming a better person. It isn't talking about circumstance improving such that friends never let you down, that you never miss aeroplanes, that the body doesn't get sick. It's not talking about improving life or improving yourself as a person. What it's talking about is a shift in attitude, a shift of seeing ourself, and essentially it is an acceptance, because it is the falling away of the non-acceptance, a falling away of the judgment. It's a shift in attitude, so it won't make you a saint. It won't improve or fix any biological shortcomings that you might have. It will allow a seeing of those biological shortcomings with different eyes, with a new attitude, with an attitude of what we could call non-doership and non-attachment to outcome, which really means the absence of the attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcome. Okay, so how do I now dovetail into the other half of the teaching, which really is about a recognition of your essence and an abiding there, a resting in that beingness, that more authentic self that is prior to the psychological self. And this half of the teaching requires much less words. Because it's not something that we can think ourselves into. It's a dimension of the human being that is often unavailable until such time as it becomes available. And it's unavailable because the thinking that I was referring to, the attitude that I was referring to, acts like a very solid gate to that dimension. And the reason that thinking acts as a gate is because the truth is that our system is convinced that that thinking is helpful. That thinking is going to get us somewhere. The system believes that blaming is somehow helpful. Feeling guilt and having expectations is helpful. And so it keeps doing it. And so if someone tells it to just stop, it says, what, are you crazy? I've got a job to do. I've got a job that will fix the situation. You know, this person has wronged me, and I'm in the process of fixing it by blaming them. That truly, when we look at how the thinking happens, is what must be ingrained in us. And that thinking is the self-image, the psychological identity, which is generally the image that exists, that life impacts, that the flow of life impacts. That self-image is really, when we look at it, a set of beliefs, which is why it can just collapse. If it was more substantial than beliefs, which thankfully beliefs have the great ability to change. Sometimes the ability for beliefs to change, even though inherently we know that, you know, we can believe one thing 1 minute, and then the next minute we can not believe it, like Santa Claus. You know, we believe it for 5 years, and then one fine day we stop believing in it. But some beliefs just persist, because life doesn't give us a reason to think differently. So that self-image remains that which interacts with life, and that which is continually attacked by the duality of life, meaning the pleasure and the pain, because that self-image has essentially said, my completeness is dependent on life being pleasure, 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 pleasure. That is its idea of itself. So when life comes along and it's not pleasure, 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 this self-image feels attacked by the very nature of daily life. That's why life is suffering. The good news is, this, one of the other noble truths is, there is a way out of suffering. The realization there is a way out of suffering. And then another of the truths is understanding the way out of suffering, which really means understanding what I'm describing So this gate that essentially separates us from this other dimension that I suggested is available for us to live from. This gate is based on the ferocity, the intensity of the functioning of this psychological self. So without certain descriptions or instructions, it's very hard for us to drop into being, drop into a more authentic self. So we're here in Tiruvannamalai, and Tiruvannamalai attracts people because of the wonderful teachings of Sri Ramana. And he talks about the self with the small s and the self, denoted by a capital S. And the inquiry that he puts forward, who am I, is a set of instructions or pointers that guides us through an inquiry that will hopefully move us from seeing ourselves as the psychological entity and move us towards a revelation, a realization, a knowing of the self, which is a self prior to the thinking about what I am. So, one of the significant teachings in my journey was, along with Ramana's teachings, but before that were the teachings of Nisargadatta Maharaj, through mainly through the book I Am That. And what was particularly pertinent to me was his suggestion, the core of the teaching, to abide in I Am. And I Am is the same as self. I, in the I Am, is not talking about a personal I, a sense of personality and being the body. In fact, in Nisargadatta's teaching, one of the key tenets is you are not the body. So when seekers would address Nisargadatta with questions that implied or presupposed him being a body, he would get angry and say, stop projecting your idea of yourself onto me. There is a core of beingness that is at the core of human experience, or the core of experience, that is prior to any thoughts. And it's covered up by the thinking. The thinking is essentially an object that arises in consciousness. It's an object that has a very specific flavor and effect on the experience. It has the effect of obscuring this resting in being. So when thinking is happening, if there is a witnessing of thinking happening, meaning in its initial stage there is an awareness that an obsessive thinking about, well, especially if it's guilt, blame, pride, worry, expectation, if that's happening and there is a registering, oh, I have this, there is this thinking happening, that in itself is significant, a seeing of the thinking. Because the identification with thought can be so great that there is no space between the thoughts and that which is aware of the thoughts. So simple descriptions like this can inspire a shift, not because someone works hard and makes this happen, but because things are heard over and over again. And they sink in often without us even realizing or understanding. In fact, in teachings it's encouraged, don't feel you need to understand all of this and store it and hold on to it in your head so that you can recite it again. Maybe just be open and trust that something is being received beyond the intellect. And then things happen on their own, not unexplainably in a sense, but a shift where the thoughts are witnessed can happen. And it's not magic, it's a result of the system having received information, and the information having changed something, and then a subsequent change in the way the experiences happened. This is very much linked to the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership. The way that thoughts arise, we're convinced I am the one thinking. I am the one doing thinking. Whereas more accurately, when a different perspective sets in, we realize thinking is happening. There is no thinker of the thoughts. And identifying ourselves as I am the thinker of the thought is the assertion of the small s. So the recognition that blame is happening, that thinking about what I will need to put in place in the next 3 years in order for, my business to be more impressive, or is thinking, and if not a stopping of it. It's not at this stage. We're not insisting on it stopping. We're more interested in becoming aware. That's a faculty that has been much less cultivated, a simple recognition of things. What we've cultivated is the obsession with changing things. And in the awareness of the thinking, we can become more aware of the content of the thinking. So the example that I've been using is blame. If the content is, why did that person do what they did? They shouldn't have done what they did. Look at what it means about me. Blame is happening. It's a happening, not my doing. It's arising out of the machinery of the human, the body-mind organism. The machinery is like a cookie machine spitting out cookies. And thinking is the output of a particularly programmed machine. The thinking of the order that is happening has to come out of this machine, like a calculator that, you put 2 plus 2, and the calculator spits out 4, because it's designed like that. And we tend to look at the thinking, especially if we hear that blame is a form of suffering and that peace of mind is available, and then we look at it and I shouldn't be thinking like this. I have to stop thinking like this. That's more of the doership and attachment to outcome. So first there's an awareness of the thinking, then there is in the awareness, without needing it to change, more clarity about what the thinking content actually is. And then we might see, it is an attitude. So confirming, this is where we can start confirming the conceptual framework. It is an attitude of personal doership. It is an attitude that says the other could have acted differently, should have acted differently. And it is an attitude, so if you feel into the blame, you might say, and yes, I think that I'm feeling that internally that attitude is telling me that what they delivered, the outcome they delivered, which let's assume it was painful, is an attack on who I am, and I can't just let them attack who I am. I have to fight back. So this is me suggesting what awareness can recognize. Awareness plus the intellect of the working mind. Right? The thinking that we are calling suffering is the thinking of what I would call the thinking mind. The thinking mind based on the deeply ingrained belief of doership and attachment to outcome. The working mind is the part of the mind that is being given these descriptions. These new descriptions. And when awareness recognizes that the blame is happening, the combination of awareness and the working mind can investigate the blame. And investigate just means understand it a little better, especially relative to these base concepts that I'm putting forward, because they're specifically part of the dynamic that's important to see. Yes, it is a narrative based on what happened with the assumption it could have been different, whereas part of this framework says life is a predetermined happening, not your doing or my doing. It's a creation. Impersonal source, in its potential form, at some point exploded into manifestation, became the story of life. And everything that happens is part of that impersonal story of life. We are part of the impersonal story of life. This speaking is part of the predetermined impersonal story of life. So this very much underpins the attitude of non-doership and non-attachment to outcomes. It's the complete opposite of what the belief in personal doership, complete opposite of how the belief in personal doership sees life. It says, no, I did it, and you did it, and if you didn't do it good enough, you should have done it better. And if I didn't do it good enough, I'm going to flog myself because I should have done it better. None of this destiny rubbish, because actually if I agree it's destiny, then I have to agree that the outcome could be anything, and I don't want the outcome to be anything because my happiness is dependent on pleasure, 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 and I'm going to make life pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. Surrender to God's will is the basis of all wisdom teachings. That might not be acceptable to a lot of people in life because the belief in personal doership is so strong. But the reason that it's at the base of all wisdom teachings is because that's where the freedom comes from. The belief in personal doership would see predetermination, would hear the concept of predetermination as the very opposite of freedom. And the fact is that it is that belief in personal doership that is the opposite of freedom. It's the belief in personal doership that creates the suffering, and liberation is freedom from suffering. So, as an awareness of the thinking happening as part of predetermined story of life based on my makeup that was part of that story of life, a seeing of the blame allows us to investigate it more clearly, see that it is based on doership and attachment to outcome, see that it isn't in line with seeing life as a divine, you could say, unfolding. And as that's seen more and more clearly as being a narrative that is out of line with our new appreciation of life, then an interesting potential kicks in. The interesting potential is that the system has in it something it didn't have before, which is the motivation to stop. To stop and be. Only once the system has effectively changed because of new conditioning and its own awareness and investigation and conclusions in itself, that thinking process, which is being guided by new conditioning that life has delivered. So the thinking is just a happening based on the person's genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so this talk is new conditioning. We don't know how the new conditioning is going to land and become part of the genes and up-to-date conditioning. But if it does, to one extent or another, then it means something is going to change because we're different to how we were yesterday, which we always are in life. Life doesn't always deliver new conditioning that radically changes, in principle, how we are. Right? We're always being changed because of new circumstance, new up-to-date conditioning, or new conditioning that changes our up-to-date conditioning, which is part of our structure. Our structure is our genetics and up-to-date conditioning. And so the investigation and the ticking off and saying, yes, that is based on the belief in personal doership, and I do see that each of us are functioning automatically according to factors that we've never controlled. So how can I be the doer Sure, the actions are happening through me, but I was programmed by life. So, don't shoot the messenger. But that's actually, I'm not saying don't shoot the messenger, because society is still going to treat us as the doer. So this shift in attitude doesn't absolve us from consequence. Right? But what it absolves us from, if it goes deep enough, is the suffering, the internal suffering. So we might function a certain way, deliver pain to society. Society will punish us. That is a consequence that's unavoidable. You can't say to the judge, hey, I'm not the doer. The judge is going to say, well, I'm not the doer either, but 2 years prison. So this understanding isn't going to absolve us from consequence, but it means that our attitude of shame can get cut off. Understanding, I was designed a certain way, I found myself in a circumstance, this action happened, and I have to admit that when I look at it objectively, it wasn't fair to society. I was stealing something that didn't belong to me. Society has the rules, and I got punished. So there doesn't have to be a denial. We can still discern the good and the bad relative to certain benchmarks. But understand that that happened as part of the overall flow of life, and that I was destined to function that way in order for destiny to unfold that way. And this destiny doesn't have to be some mystical belief, or why if we just understand that the human being is a result of their genes and up-to-date conditioning, and in each moment we are one way. Like if you could take a snapshot of the human being, it's a very complex system based on the genetics and the up-to-date conditioning. And every function that happens through that, the speaking, the thinking, the emotions, the hunger, the actions, which are just a consequence, happen because we are in a circumstance, we see something, hear something, smell something, touch something, taste something, and we weren't in control of that circumstance being that way. We see something, for example, and there is an internal reaction of this very complex organism, and a thought arises. And that thought might lead to, we see a bird, that's a strange bird, I've never seen that. And that thought then leads to, I'm going to take a photo. And so we pick up the phone and take a photo. All a very complex series of happenings based on a circumstance we're not in control of, based on a makeup that we're not in control of. So everything that happens through the human being is a happening according to life's will, according to God's will, according to source, according to the predetermined. From the perspective of the human being, we get to see it after it happens. We get to see the thought after it arises. We get to see the words that come out of our mouth after they come out of our mouth. And so from the perspective of the one aware of what's happening, we can say, whatever happens relative to that one that is aware was predetermined. Not my doing. I didn't create it that way. And so that can cut off the suffering. That understanding will cut off the suffering as it goes deeper and deeper and deeper. And that's what allows the abiding in I am to happen. A motivation of the body-mind organism, to stop doing what it was doing obsessively, on the basis it's not true. But the system has to really come to appreciate it's not true. Right? And so if the system then starts to appreciate, not only is it not true, but it's stopping me from being. It's stopping me from resting in this dimension of myself. that isn't concerned with what's happening in the flow of life. That becomes self-confirming when we drop in there. We find, here I am. And we know, what I am is not dependent on outcomes. When I rest here, the importance on, rectifying what someone has done falls away. And we realize, we can feel from our own experience, what a relief. And that's the freedom from suffering. Like, here I am. That's the remembering. Remember who you are. And actually, I hope it's clear. The remembering isn't a thinking, I am that which is not affected by pleasure or pain. It's a dropping into being where you are, where you be that, and everything changes in an instant. And when you see what changes, you know what I am is not dependent on life being a particular way. So the more often we drop into being in the face of painful circumstance and find that the suffering that was interpreting the circumstance a certain way gets cut off, the more we have our own confirmation. It's self-confirming that what I am is not affected by the flow of life. What I am at my core is not affected by the flow of life. Not a concept anymore, it becomes our truth. It becomes our self-confirming experience. And so Nisargadatta's guru, Siddharameshwar Maharaj, instructed Nisargadatta, abide in I am. That was his instruction. Which really means drop back into your being, out of the thinking that is misinterpreting and prioritizing pleasure and pain beyond what they actually are for your essence. Drop out of that thinking into being as often as possible. Abide in I am. That abiding in I am will start off with a dropping into being that will last for about a quarter of a second. Because the thinking mind is like a flywheel that has a lot of momentum, and awareness sees the thinking mind, the blame in the example we're using, and says, it's not true. Remember, be or abide in I am. So in my journey, what set into place was a thought that arose as a bookmark. Well, what's the word? It contained this thought, which was the thought I am, contained in it so much of what I'm speaking about today. For example, the understanding based on investigation that what I am is not dependent on pleasure or pain. It understood that the psychological identity is convinced that they need pleasure, 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 and therefore is attached to pleasure. It includes the understanding of the belief of personal doership, and the inverse understanding that sees, actually I'm not the doer, the other isn't the doer. So all of that understanding that happens as the investigation of your own daily life happens on its own when you're walking down the street and awareness lands on certain thinking and certain contemplations arise saying, is it true that I did this, or was it a result of a circumstance I had no control of and my makeup, and therefore that was the response, and it was just a happening? So as that understanding gets deeper and deeper, it was all contained in the thought I am, for me. And the instruction to abide in I am, which is really just a suggestion, not really a prescription of something to do. It's saying, if awareness lands on blame, then maybe the thought I am will arise that cuts off the thinking, because it contains all of that wisdom in it. The wisdom that essentially says, this is nonsense, and it's keeping me away from knowing myself. So awareness sees the blame, the thought I am arises, and then the thought itself is like the bookmark, the bookend to the thinking, and hopefully it cuts it off mid-sentence, so we don't even need to give it the respect for the sentence to finish, the blame, because I am realize it's all nonsense, So I don't even want to entertain it a millisecond longer. So awareness sees it, I am, and a dropping into being. But because that thinking at first isn't completely disbelieved, we rest there for about a quarter of a second and we're propelled back into the thinking, and it carries on more or less where it left off, and it could be 15 minutes before we realize, oh, hang on, what happened? Didn't I drop into being? And then a realization, but for the last 15 minutes I've been thinking of that blame again. Because what happened is the blame was happening, a recognition, the thought I am came up, we dropped into being for about a quarter of a second, went straight back into the thinking, and it happened, and it took 15 more minutes before awareness landed on the fact that it's happening again. And in that moment, the thought I am can come up again, and we drop back into being. And after 2 weeks of maybe this setting in, because I really don't suggest it as a prescription to someone who says, oh, how do I do it? Tell me what to do. Because I'm really good at doing things and I'm going to do it better than everyone else, and I'm going to spend my whole days just being diligent at doing this I am. That's the doer trying to do that. So hopefully it comes from a wisdom where our system has changed and we really see the blame as being a disturbance, a gate, and a natural cutting off happens, we drop into being. And then after week 2 of that happening, and there could be a month where it doesn't happen because it just doesn't happen, we find we get to rest there for half a second instead of quarter of a second or a second. And the mind that is attached to outcome could easily say, this isn't working. Which is a shame, because it could be like training a dog to sit, and you say, sit, and the dog does nothing. And then you say, sit, and nothing. And you say it 5 times, and the dog doesn't, and you think, this isn't working. But if you say it a 6th time, the dog might sit. And so if you were to stop after 5 times and say, this doesn't work, it's just because a persistence hasn't prevailed. Because it was working, it was 5/6 of the way there. And even when the dog sits the 6th time, then it's not going to sit for the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th, because the dog's still learning. So a process of training the dog can take time. And the dropping into being, into I am, is like training a muscle that has atrophied. But you'll find a sweetness, and at some point that can become your home. Because the suffering stops arising altogether, because the understanding becomes so deep that it's not a matter of the suffering being there and then it being cut off. It gets cut off before it arises. That way of interpreting life no longer makes sense. There's no more left that sees life that way. And then abiding in I am becomes the default rather than what we're more familiar with, which is the thinking and the suffering as the default, and occasionally a glimpse into peace of mind. And this dropping into I am can be aided by a visualization of the center of consciousness drifting down into the heart, and simultaneously a softening of the gaze, a widening of the turning it into a panoramic view of life, and being with what is, meaning being with the full experience that is in this moment, and watching the automaticness of all the people. Traffic lights is great if you sit at a coffee shop and just sit and watch people stopping when the lights, well, not in India, when the lights are red, and then and then everyone walks, and the cars moving, and just allowing everything to be as it is. I mean, you don't need to wait to go to a coffee shop in the West. I mean, you can go and sit at a chai shop here and see the same great activity of life without any need to change it. Just an allowing and an awareness, just like an awareness of the thinking as a happening, witnessing thinking happening, witness life happening. And maybe the body, as it shifts in the chair or crosses his leg, can be also witnessed as a happening within the overall experience. And that starts to become, or that is a movement towards or away from this hyper-involvement with what is happening. So you can watch feelings of hunger arise in a body-mind organism. I tend to leave not enough time for questions lately. So today I think you might have been told that we have to vacate by 10 to 6, so that's another half an hour. So I'll open up for questions. There's a microphone here, so
Check. The sense of your teaching is that to find out who I am. And decades of learning and being under your stewardship, I found out there is an amness in me. Please correct me if I'm wrong. There is an amness in me. And today's teaching is a thought pops up which is not mine. It's from the impersonal self. There is an amness, a thought pops, not mine. Then an action follows, not mine, by the robot. So which part of this sequence of the amness, the thought and the action, which is actually the human mind-body organism, are you addressing from where? Which part is recognizing this fact? Is it the amness here? Or is it some mysterious in between the impersonal self and the amness? Following me?
Well, you see, what I'm putting forward here is a particular solution to a functioning in the human being. More specific, I can say, you are not the body. Because we need to focus on that aspect that is not the body. At some point, it may become necessary to say, well, actually, it's not entirely true to say you are not the body. Because we're a human being that includes the body. So more specifically, the teaching is saying the biological and psychological functioning is automatic and not your doing. So there is an aspect of the human being that I'm focusing on in this particular session, saying what you are is the intangible sense of being and awareness that can witness thoughts as a happening, actions as a happening, not my doing, not exactly not my thought, but not thought that I'm in control of. And in the early stages, or it's not really early as in very basic spirituality, because what we're talking about here is in itself not necessarily basic. A lot of the world would have walked out of the room a long time ago. So for people to remain interested in a teaching that focuses on non-doership, or you are not the person in itself, is significant. But in dropping into this being, it's worth actually remaining with the notion, I am not the body, I am not the thinking, and finding yourself grounded, yourself meaning this I amness and awareness does have the sense of self in it. And so there isn't you grounded in the self, there is just the self. Witnessing life as a happening, witnessing thoughts arising. So it's not so important who I'm talking to. What's more important is for the words to penetrate the system and for a seeing of thinking as a happening, a seeing of the biological feelings as a happening, and even the actions, the moving of the hands, the words as a happening. And that doesn't actually require us to think it into existence. In fact, if we try and think it into existence, it won't happen. So it's much better to find ourselves interested in what is here right now, without the need to change it, and without the need to label everything and say, oh, that's a car. Actually, that car's going too fast. And that's a nice car, that's a red car, that's a bird. Just drop back out of that, if it happens, and allow all of it to happen. And we'll notice that there is a seeing of it all without us needing to judge it or even label it. So I think in this particular instance, it's not worth putting too many fine details on.
So the essence is that there is no cause and effect. I mean, that's the totality. Just be in the amness, abide by the amness. But in routine life, a lot of times we forget about it. As you said, quarter of a second this pops up, then 15 minutes you're off. So at that point in time, again, go back to the amness and the abideness.
Yeah.
In a sense of non-doership, sort of.
Yes,
automatic.
Because this part of the teaching is really emphasizing that there is a movement that is available that has atrophied, or there is a dimension of the human being that is available but is blocked off. And so all that is being suggested is information that can help reverse that and strengthen that movement. Once it's strengthened, like once a tennis player has done their forehand and backhand 8,000 times on this side, 8,000 times on that side, that then becomes first nature to them, and they just play tennis.
Can we say in terms of information technology that from childhood we have been ingrained in a wrong operating system?
Yes.
And we are now sort of changing the motherboard. with these teachings.
Yeah, and it can be, it's a combination of what society's conditioning has been on us as to what the priorities are and how we have to, pleasure and good is what the world needs to be and bad not. Even, it's quite simply, your parents like the pleasure of silence, let's say, and you're a child making noise and they tell you you shouldn't do that, let's say, you get punished or whatever. So that's really just their attachment to pleasure. And it becomes ingrained in you, and society is telling you how you should and shouldn't act. And we've adopted that judgment based on those instructions. So not only the conditioning of society, but also the way that the senses develop and the way the world is cognized is a much stronger influencing factor on ingraining the belief of personal doership and attachment to outcome, because it's how the world is perceived. So this suggestion to just watch shifts something in the brain, you can say, and it changes the quality of the experience, a quality of just allowing the whole experience to be seen without focusing in on one aspect. And we, because we're attached to outcomes, have become trained on focusing in on one aspect. And so then it's this sense of a subject and a separate object. And so this suggestion is about bringing in a new experience of life that can start reversing how the senses have created, the senses in the brain and our priorities have created the experience of life previously.
Why is this impersonal self doing all this? That's the villain or the hero, whatever you call it. That's what's running this entire puppet show.
You can't help yourself, can you?
I got it.
This, right? If there is still but, you can start seeing that as blame. It's not blame, but another form of, I am, come back. And you come back. You don't need answers to those questions. Actually, needing answers to the questions is part of the muscle that has been strengthened. So when you realize that and see it in itself is stopping the being, just I am. It's so nice. We have a tool that allows us, it becomes our own system has essentially developed an activism squad, right? That is finally able to stand up to the ignorance. And before that, there was just the ignorance and no rebel. And this is now a part of our system that recognizes the error in our system. It's like an antivirus program. It's like antibiotics. That part of our system is saying, stop and be. And I like the prompt I am. For me, that's how, allow whatever happens to you, for happens to work for you. I am is just a reminder when we see the thinking getting being overactive, keeping us disconnected. I am and be. Allow a little smile. Don't make it happen, but as soon as we drop into being, a little smile comes up because it remembers, here I am. And the I that we drop into, the dimension, is self-confirming. What it self-confirms is that it is invulnerable. It is unaffected by the flow of life. So if someone you love dies, there will be emotional pain. Now, emotional pain is not suffering, but very often emotional pain will turn into suffering. The suffering will say, what am I going to be without this person? The emotional pain is the pain, just a biological pain of having lost someone you care for. The psychological suffering is the extra layer of I am now incomplete and all of that, that's psychological. And if that happens, and we remember, no, I am, and it does cut off the psychological suffering, and we come in an instant, this little smile comes to, because it realizes, oh, I am, as in, I am complete, I am here, I don't need anything extra, even in the face of this unfortunate circumstance. And that doesn't mean that we don't get to feel the emotional pain, because emotional pain, you don't want, it's not a bypassing of the biological level of life. Right? So we will still feel emotional pain, but the emotional pain actually is nowhere near as uncomfortable as the suffering. What we find is emotional pain, biological or physical pain, financial pain, is still there because it's not our preference, but without the suffering, it's completely manageable.
Yeah, I was just going to say, there's a word that I don't hear too often, especially in non-duality, is feeling. And for me, when dropping into my being, it comes as a feeling. That's the confirmation. Because it feels so good. So, and it seems like what's happening is a developing of the faculty to feel, which is we're kind of really out of balance in life. Usually it's all about thinking, but the true confirmation is, at the end of the day, is the feeling. For me, like the feeling the peace. Mm-hmm. And abiding in that kind of, the thinking doesn't have as much significance. Mm-hmm. It just seems hardly anyone kind of mentions feeling, like it's I think it's a big overlooked a lot.
Well, I agree, and then I guess I disagree in the sense that there are some non-dual teachings that are so emphatic because they have to be about stop. Just stop any of your interpretation of life, like saying, but what about when I go back home? Stop. You're here, and drop into, and what they're emphasizing is drop out of thinking into feeling. So the important thing is what you're saying is completely necessary, that there does need to be instruction that says, hey, you're not going to ever find yourself in your stream of conceptual thinking about things. If you're interested in the abiding in I am, you have to find a dropping into the body. That's where you find the depth of the human being, where the I am abides, in the body. And what you say is completely correct, that we have become obsessed in interpreting life and feeling life, which isn't real feeling, through thinking. So when I realized this about myself, it was because I was reading teachings at that time and listening to teachings that were focusing on this, and I thought that I was feeling. And one day someone asked me, how do you feel today? And I remember my eyes went up into the top corner of my head, which I realized that's me looking for the answer in thought. And I said, that's not what they're asking. But I realized that I always give an answer that seems appropriate based on thought. And it occurred to me, I'm not feeling. And that, in that moment, it inspired a dropping into the body. But until that point, I never realized that I wasn't actually feeling. So, what you brought up is super important, because this notion of stop, or I am, which is a stop, where do you go? You go into the body. Now, what a lot of people might experience is they go into the body, it's hugely uncomfortable. No sense of I am. It's come in here and it's a nightmare, because there's so much energies locked away in the body that the only refuge they have from the energies is in some conceptual world. If that's the case, then there's some different work that needs to be done, once again, in the body. And there's no escaping that. You can't go out of the body because it's uncomfortable and think you're going to get a connection to self. So one way or another, there has to be a coming into the body. Hopefully, dropping out of thinking into the body reveals this space of I amness. Now, another thing I want to add, which is very pertinent to the teaching, and I just maybe people won't, it can be confusing, but I want to put it in there. And the feeling of beingness is not peace of mind.
I was kind of, I want to ask you the other day, because you were talking about peace of mind, and I was talking about peace, and it's kind of like,
Yeah.
it's slightly different.
But yeah, even if I call it peace, as in happiness is the end of suffering and that's peace, right? Peace or peace of mind is not a feeling of peace. It's not the sweetness of being. And this is why it may or may not be appropriate in this, is that when someone is the practice of abiding in I am is important, and that's what I've been speaking about today. This distinction is not so important, because there's two gears we can be in. We can be in the suffering, or we can drop into being. Right? And that's the relief from suffering. So that's the path that needs to be forged. We need somewhere to go, and not really we need, there needs to be, another place, because if there isn't, and we just try stopping the thinking, it goes stop, but we don't drop into being, it's like holding your breath, right? And you can only do it for so long, and then, so really you're remaining on the thinking level, and you create a stop, and then it starts again. And in a way, you'll probably find that the stop on the level of, if we remain in the thinking, is actually more thinking, saying, I have to stop, right? Dropping into being is a place where we can rest for an extended period of time without any thinking, because there is a new activity happening, which is just witnessing happening. And because this suffering dynamic often isn't described in conceptual terms, what can happen when the only teaching that is given is stop thinking and rest in I am and being, is that movement to the heart gets stronger, and it happens, but we find ourselves getting pulled out into suffering because the roots haven't really been looked at, because we haven't been given pointers to look at it. In fact, the teachings say it's not important, like I was saying, it's not important to understand the dynamics, just be. And that's why I started off saying the teachings have two components. There's the framework, and then there's this abiding in I am, which really needs us to stop thinking and be, but we can't stop until the framework has weakened the system, right? And the framework that's given in other teachings is a framework that's less conceptual, and some pointers that allow us to drop into being, and that can become sort of something we're familiar with. But then when we go out into daily life, we keep getting triggered because the deeply ingrained roots don't get uprooted by just dropping into being.
I was going to say that. Is it when you rest in being, though, does it not dissolve some of the conditioning? Because I was thinking the other day, you can see how up-to-date conditioning happens, and there is a way. It's like, say, you could call it samskaras, or it's not like you're condemned to keep repeating that, because, like with any kind of habit, if you just stop doing it, it dissolves, it goes away. You know?
Yeah.
For example, like any addiction, you know, if you say you're a smoker, if you stop, it gets less and less. It doesn't, you know.
Yes, but usually aided with some thinking that we might not even realize. And as we stop, we do start realizing certain things. So eventually a thought says, actually, I don't need to worry about that. All of that's extra. But if we're left to our own devices to figure that out, it takes longer than when you're given specific descriptions. So the point that I'm trying to make is that this place of being is, for a long time, is synonymous with peace of mind. That's what we know as peace of mind, where we've dropped into being and suffering has stopped. The point I want to make is that once the suffering stops altogether, even this place of being becomes somewhat irrelevant. Now, when it is the refuge that we keep dropping out of into suffering, it doesn't make sense that it's irrelevant, because it says, no, that's my home, that's my refuge, that's where I go when the suffering is cut off. Right? And if we look at it closely and we realize, oh, it's so precious, because that's the mechanism in a way that cuts off the suffering and weakens it. And once that mechanism of dropping into being has, and plus the conceptual frameworks have completely dissolved the suffering, then hopefully someone comes along and says, actually what you're looking for is not to live your life from being. What you're looking for is unbroken peace of mind, and peace of mind is even simpler than being. Peace of mind is the absence of suffering. And being is more than that. Being is, as you were saying, a feeling. There's a sweetness in it. So then we don't even need to insist on being there as part of the experience of life. It can be very often, but if it drops away because we are involved in something, let's say, in doing a practical thing, then we realize, oh, I don't even need the sweetness of being. It's available anytime. When you're missing it, you can drop back into being and feel it. And when there's nothing to do in life, or you're watching a sunset, you drop into and you feel it. But you then realize even that is extra, and I'm grateful for it. It's a gift as part of life. But really what we're looking for is unbroken peace of mind, which in this description is just the absence of the psychological suffering and not the additional feeling of peace. But that doesn't mean, oh, I'm looking for peace of mind, so I don't want the sweetness of being. And it's not about pushing that away. It's about really recognizing what is available on a continuous, unbroken basis is the absolutely ordinary and very, very simple peace of mind that is even simpler than the beautiful sense of being. But that comes after being has become the priority. That's why in this talk I'm saying, abide in I am, abide in being. Because you can't, that's the mechanism that weakens, along with the conceptual framework, the suffering.
Yeah, but, in one way, like if you're not the doer, surrender, like when you do rest in your being, you're kind of giving up the control, like your control, and trusting that this being, which is way more intelligent than we could ever be, will manifest more in your life and start to take control of your life in a way.
Yes.
No, rather than just thinking it's me that's doing it all. Just surrendering to that in a way and letting that be.
Yeah, beautiful. That's exactly, and then that's when we see, we're being lived by life. And contrary to the thinking mind that thinks, well, if I just let life unfold, it's going to be chaotic, we actually find that there is this beautiful intelligence that lives me in a way that is often much more fruitful and efficient, without that even being our objective. So there's time for maybe one more interaction if that's needed, or else we can...
Okay, hi. Thank
Hello.
you for your wise talk. My question is about self and also being and also what I am. I'm curious because, I'm from Finland and the education system is quite based on knowledge, and also your talk feels very familiar to me, so it's easy to accept. But here in India and Tiruvannamalai, I often hear the concept of energetic body, and chakras. And this is, of course, I've heard it like 15 or 20 years ago, this concept, but I don't know what to think about it. How does it affect to self, if it's there, or, for example, the main chakras, like 7 chakras, root and heart and third eye and etc. So, what do you think about it? How does it? Do you believe in it? And how does it affect my present?
Well, I don't think it's about believing in it. It's as we become more and more familiar with the human experience, then these things reveal themselves or not. Now, whether that reveals itself or whether that it doesn't have to be part of this journey, although when the beliefs start falling away, there is a rewiring in a sense. There is the beliefs tend to be blockages in a way. Okay, so my answer in brief, let's see if I keep it brief, is that there is a biological and psychological entity through which consciousness functions, which we can call the human being. And the freedom is when the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome, which is part of the human being, falls away. And then there is still a human being that is the biological entity through which consciousness functions without the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. Now, the entity is a very complex entity. The instrument is a very complex instrument. And in the various Vedas, they talk about sheaths, different sheaths, which are different layers to the person, starting with the gross and moving to the more subtle. And in a way, they mirror each other. So an example on the energetic body, which is one of the 7, or in some other systems there's probably 30 different sheets, but let's just call 2, the physical and then an energetic. There's emotional, there's all sorts of different sheets. But and the chakras in the energetic system are like power centers, and each one has a different flavor, a different type of energy, you could say. And so the heart, the physical heart and the heart chakra are on two different bodies, but they are linked in a way. And the same with the other sheaths. There is a correspondence all the way through all of the sheaths. And as certain beliefs change, it changes the structure on all of the different levels. And not necessarily in the same way on all of them, but maybe a certain belief has a much bigger effect on one of the bodies, or one of the aspects of the human, one of the sheaths. And as these blocks, these beliefs change, then it's sort of like cleaning out pipes, and energy starts to flow, it rebalances itself in the system. And as that happens, you can start to feel jerks and palpitations, and so being in a place like this, there is a particular frequency. There are lots of places in Earth that have frequencies that are palpable to certain people, and that could be as simple as geological structures, or it could be much more mystical. And certain frequencies tend to have more of an effect on loosening up some of the bodies, let's say, or some of the blocks. And so for some people, they'll come into a place like Tiruvannamalai or Ubud in Bali, or certain parts of Hawaii, Guatemala, I think, and without even thinking it, they might be in the car, and then they realize, oh, something's different. And then they remember, oh, this happened last time as well. And you might go to the Virupaksha cave and feel things. And it's not going to be the same for everyone, because everyone's body is different, the blocks are different, and the sensitivity is different. And so some people come to Tiruvannamalai and other people don't. So there are energies of even teachers, because they have the blocks have changed in them, and so their energetic frequency changes, and it doesn't have the frequency of the suffering and the doership. And so coming in to that field can be like two tuning forks, and one will bring the other one into the same resonance. And so in that field, certain changes can be helped by that frequency.
But thank you. Can there be some sort of blocks, because three different healers have now said to me that I have some sort of blocks. So the last one said that it affects really much on certain area of my life. So I'm now thinking that, of course, you can't answer for that. That's for me, of course. That do I believe it or not? But I want to believe that I can still change it by myself. But somebody is saying that some sort of treatment should be done, because it's not, up to you anymore. It's some sort of negative energies.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know what to think about it.
Well,
as a part of myself and being. Yeah.
Well, we never change the blocks. They change because of what life brings in. So even if what we think is, I thought about it differently and then the block got released, was you thought about it differently because life inspired a thing, because you read a book, let's say, or you spoke to someone, or you came to Satsang. And sometimes the changes can happen with what seems like an internal process of your own thinking, which is actually not in your control. It's because of how you've been influenced. And sometimes going for massages or energy work, going to sit in a cave that has a particular thing, can be what helps change things. My advice is just do what feels right.
Thank you. That's what I have done. Yeah.
Yeah.